So Lord Howard of Effingham. An interesting gentleman, definitely. And probably one of those forgotten characters when it comes to the Spanish Armada, when it comes to history in general. Because we remember the dashing Drake, the haunting and effective Hawkins. We even talk about Sir Walter Raleigh, the perfect gentleman who was also far too much of a scallywag, really. And who, whenever I talk about someone, and I'm not going to name names, gets very excited. Can't think who, Raleigh. Why would you get excited when I talk about Sir Walter Raleigh? Anyway, we tend to think about all those characters. We don't think about Effingham. And he's a really interesting gentleman to talk about in this scenario because he's not like his counterpart. He's not like the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who's put in charge of the Armada, Spanish Armada, with basically no naval experience. Lord Howard of Effingham is the Lord High Admiral of Britain. We're talking about Effingham, not Raleigh this time. Okay? We don't talk about Raleigh in every single video. He has experience, and he comes from a line of people who have served in this role. Which might not be how we tend to understand, you getting a post today, but in this period that was quite common. Because if you don't have a mass education system, usually what you're going to rely on for people is what have they already done in terms of their experience, and what has their family done, because the families tend to teach people what they've done. And this is the thing. When we're talking about Lord Howard of Effingham, well, Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, we often get this picture put up. And there's a small problem with this picture. He looks old. And he is old. He's 84 years old at this point. He was 52 years old when he was leading the British forces, the English forces I should say, but there were forces from Ireland, there was some personnel from Scotland, so I would say it's more apt to often describe it as British forces because it was an interesting band of collection once you get into the exact complement of who these ships were. And you have to remember, quite a lot of the ships did come and were based from Cornwall as well, which means they have an even more interesting crew set, but we'll leave that to one side. He's often remembered as this oldest man, this elder statesman, but this is him post the Armada. This is the status he achieves after the Armada, after his victory, after what he does. And you also have to remember, this is a period when you have the British starting in both Scotland and England to really professionalise support for the navies. Henry VIII, Henry VII have done a lot of work in this regard. Mary, what can I say about Queen Mary? Well, both her and Edward didn't undo any of the work their predecessors had done, so I suppose that's something we can say. But realistically, Mary doesn't really understand what a navy is or what it's for, and doesn't understand the whole concept of infrastructure. In fact, honestly, she leaves the whole thing of logistics to someone else is a constant. Elizabeth, well, the thing about Elizabeth I, when you're in the position you're in where she is, and especially when you start taking advantage of the situation you're given to try and make some money, you suddenly get very interested in these things. And whilst it's not really what we would call a professional navy at this point, she does take a lot of interest in making certain things viable and work. She's one of the first people. Remember when I was talking about the board of the board of the Admiralty, talking about a Navy board, the people who did all the maintenance and eventually with this role which is subsumed into the Third Sea Lord's office. Well, she's one of the ones who first starts appointing people who are victuallers to that, people in charge of food, people in charge of making sure the fleet has the correct provisions. She does that based on the experience of what her explorers, what her adventurers have been going off and fighting wars and doing, and how they've been needing to provision ships. Now, this doesn't necessarily always go to plan, and there are issues, One of the issues I would say with the Elizabethan model of ship management is the fact that crews are paid when they finish their service. They paid when they're allowed off ship. Which does make sense, because there's no guarantee they'll come back aboard the ship if you let them off without the pay, let them off. And if you don't pay them before you let them off, well, then they definitely won't come back. But the thing is, the moment you pay them, they want to get ashore and spend that money quite often, or put it into the various places they can put it for safekeeping, because keeping your money aboard ship is not really an option. So yeah, there are issues going on. But the thing is, this is her man. This is her naval officer. He's her Lord High Admiral. And he's got the experience he needs to do the role. He was educated by John Fox, and, he was one of the people being educated alongside the children of Henry Howard. That was the Earl of Surrey, who was, of course, I think his uncle. Probably cousin is easier one to put it in. It's a whole interesting relationship once you get into the Howard Effingham family. And from this education, he then builds himself up. He really does build himself up. He takes part in various operations, various diplomatic events, various work with his father at sea. He spent time in France. And, well, how do I put this? His time in France was not as long as it might have been aimed to be, because his father decided he was getting questionable, maybe unexpected treatment. Basically, he wasn't being treated as he should be. He wasn't being educated. He was being used as a servant, and that was not what he'd been sent there for. It's one of those old things. You're sending these people out to learn. Yes, they might fulfill a service role as well, but they need to be learning. You need to be teaching them. If their role is all about service and there is no education, then you're not fulfilling your side of the bargain. It's kind of like apprentices. In fact, it very much is an apprenticeship. The whole point is that apprentice is someone who's training up and who's going to be working for you, but you're supposed to be teaching them to do the job so they can become you at some point and fulfill your role and become the master. If, however, a master is not teaching those apprentices, is just going, do this, do that, not helping them, not explaining why they need to do the things, that's not a good way of learning. That's not encouraging them or teaching them anything. Just using them as indentured servants. But still, he learns French well enough that he helps take part in the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrai, which is a peace negotiation between England and France between 1558 and 1559 period. It takes about a year or so. And if you consider, at that point, he's now 22 years old. He's born in 1536. It's after that he serves as ambassador of France, and then 1562 the Queen makes him the keeper of her house and park at Oatlands. He had some ongoing relationship with the Queen, but Queen Elizabeth I, but she doesn't seem to have been overly promoting him, etc. He's very much an experience-based position. You have to remember that's what he's serving in. That's what he's going for. Lord High Admiral is a rather curious post, because for quite a long part of its history, it becomes yes, you're a noble, but you've got to have experience before you're getting it. You're not just going to get this because your father was it, or because you're important. You have to have had experience and be trusted, because you're going to go out and be in charge of some very expensive, very valuable things, and making some crucial decisions. And his diplomacy experience and management experience was increasingly important. He represented Surrey in the House of Commons in 1563 and 1572 as a Member of Parliament. He became a member of Gray's Inn, which was a sort of his how do I put this? One of the Inns of Court in London. And he received his Master of Arts degree from Cambridge in 1571. It was a normal thing to an extent for people of his rank to do. He's not going to be a lawyer, must be noted that, but it's normal to get legal training because they'll often have to act in a quasi-judicial or judicial role. And he would be involved in quasi-judicial rulings in terms of the honour of the Queen. So it's quite normal for people, remember the lords, lords and nobles, to go for that training. And believe it or not, it's not again a pro forma thing. You might be surprised to hear this, but even in 1571, getting a Master of Arts degree at Cambridge, you're not getting that for doing nothing. You're not going to just go, oh, you're Lord Charles Howard. Oh, how wonderful. Here, have a degree. No. That's what they have honorary degrees for. If you're not getting an honorary degree, then you've done work for it, even in this period. His first senior military posting was General of the Horse in 1569, and he took part in the suppression of the Catholic rebellion in northern England. But he wasn't really comfortable with that. He really wasn't comfortable with that. But there's a state visit in 1570 of the Queen of Spain, and that particular visit required someone to lead a squadron of ships, and they wanted to be careful about who they sent and how they sent. And so, Effingham was put in charge. He was a safe pair of hands, but he wasn't yet senior enough. The exact wording of the appointment was ordering him, together with William Winter, to meet the Queen of Spain and of Austria, who would shortly be travelling by sea from the Low Countries to Spain, ordering him to greet her in Elizabeth's name, and offering her free passage and any additional ships or support she may require. You shall further say that although there hath of late time happened some shew of unkindness betwixt us and the King of Spain, now her husband, which we impute to the mishap of evil conditioned ministers, yet we cannot suffer any occasion to pass over wherein we may show our any kindness to her above for the Emperor's sake, her father, and for her king, her husband's sake. It's always a nice thing. You're doing a diplomatic thing. We're going to escort the King of Spain's wife, who is also the daughter of the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, that is. And while we're doing it, we're going to make a point that the problem is the ambassador and what he's been saying. Not our problem with the king. Always a nice thing to send. And that, of course, was a few years before the Armada. So, this was 1570, so it was a year before he got his Master of Arts, but 6 years after he'd become a member of the Gray's Inn. He does this job well, and he becomes Sir Charles Howard in 1572. And then when his father dies in 73, he becomes Lord Howard of Effingham. At this point, he seems to devote himself a little bit to the arts, and decided that he was going to become a patron of a playing company. They start out as being called Nottingham's Men, later become the Admiral's Men, because they are sponsored primarily by the Lord High Admiral. And it's good to be putting on plays and things at court. It's good to be displaying these things, because that shows you're not just a powerful person or an artistically encouraged person, but it also is a nice way of showing how much wealth you have. I have so much money, I can afford to pay for all these people to sit around and put on plays. And yes, there might be some money and donations from the viewers, but without my patronage, it ain't happening. Now, in 1575, he's elected to the Order of Garter, replacing his cousin, Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, who had the terrible issue of being executed, which meant he couldn't continue in the role. But it's important for the Howard family, this. You're replacing one Howard with another Howard. It keeps the family going. And this is one of the points of history which is often interesting for people to try and figure out when you look at British history. It's quite how the families keep going. Hendersons, Howards, Richmonds, Collingwoods. You will find these names going through history. If you look really, really careful, you'll find the Hewitt Clarks in there as well sometimes. But they're usually slightly better at avoiding official appointments. In 1585, he's made Lord High Admiral. And that's important because he has experience in the role. His family have experience in the role. He's the 4th Howard to be in the role since 1512. He's been preceded by Sir Edward Howard, Thomas Howard, Earl Surrey, and as he's also, of course, his own father, William Howard, who'd been in the role 1554 to 1558. So he achieves the role in 1585, and he'll hold it till 1619. Mostly because he does a friggin' good job. Now the thing is, when he's selected and put in post, there are lots of people who are very happy about this. Because you see, with the saluting and other things, which have to be properly attended to, and the duties of an admiral in this time period, which run the full gamut from customs and excise to border security, judiciary, especially the admiral's court, and all these things. Such an appointment is important. Whilst you may have an issue with a monarch, they might be annoying, the person who's probably day-to-day impact on you as the French, for example, is going to be the greatest, is whoever's Lord High Admiral. Because they are going to set the tone for how the naval operations are going to be conducted in the Channel. Whether there is going to be diplomacy, whether there is going to be things which are going to make it practical to work when you need it to work. It's unsurprising, therefore, that the French ambassador at this time decides to write a lovely letter to Sir Francis Walsingham. Sir Francis Walsingham. And this is Guillaume d'Albesny de Le Chateauneuf. Guillaume? Basically William. d'Albesny de Chateauneuf. I always love it on the French. If you really want to have fun tongue twisters, go through the French ambassadors to England's names, okay? It's a beautiful list to work through of things that you're going, how can I position my tongue to do this? And he wrote to Walsingham, who was the Queen's private secretary, but as we all know, also a spy master, and pretty much independent foreign policy contractor, as far as the Queen was concerned. It was useful for her to have him to do these roles. So, and the thing is, everyone knows he does these roles. Okay, it's one of those open secrets. They know Walsingham is spy master, but also assassin in chief, pretty much, as far as they're concerned. There isn't much difference between those two. If someone disappears and it's in the Queen's favour, the odds are Walsingham had something to do with it, and we know that through history. But the thing is, it's not really a big secret at the time, because he's the Queen's secretary. And believe it or not, the Queen will have her senior minister, who'll be her chief of government, and she'll have her secretary, who'll basically be her right hand, left hands. And whilst you will see what the right hand of judgment is doing all the time, the left hand can be off doing all sorts of things. It can be. Anyway, what does Chateauneuf write to Walsingham? A choice worthy of her virtue and prudence, and very necessary for the Admiralty. I pray you tell her that the King of France has written to me, or rather, just the King, probably. I've got a translation, which is an interesting source. Has written me to express to thank her for having elected so good an admiral, from whom he hopes great things for the peace of his subjects. This is a role which requires absolute discretion, administration capability, judicial knowledge because of your quasi-judicial role, so you need understanding of the law, and diplomatic ability. It also requires you be a very, very competent leader. Why am I saying you have to be a very competent leader? Because, believe it or not, you don't get the things you have for later admirals. This is why I wanted to talk about these early admirals, and why I want to talk about them as leaders. Because for me, they are a really interesting case in point. Because let's consider, if we have the Armada, what the leadership strategy was. So, are we talking about a group of 20, 30, 40-year service veterans who have been serving alongside each other, have had the same common education, training, experience using standardized ships, standardized communication, have a long history of working together? No, we don't. What we have are a load of personnel who have made their own way up. You have a mixture of people who've literally fought their way up, and quite literally fought their way up, and a mixture of people who are appointees who've come from the right backgrounds. And they may not even all have the right naval experience. It might just be, like again with the Duke of Medina Sidonia, you need someone to fulfill this role who has the right connections to interface with the right people. You've got people who are gentlemen explorers, people who are privateers, which is basically a nice phrase for pirate, but the reason it's a nice phrase, and this is why my family liked being privateers, you have a nice get-out-of-jail-free clause because you're technically acting on behalf of a government. You've been given a license to do it by a government. Sometimes you have to go really far to find someone to give you a license, an Amazon tribe or something to sign it, so you're representing them, but you are acting as government, so therefore the laws of war are ascribed to you as they were historically and confused. And whilst we might think laws of war are something new, something different, something we've come up with only recently, thanks to, I don't know, the Boer War and the Canadians in World War I. But no, sadly, laws of war have been around for a long time. Chivalric code has been something which has been going along for a long, long time. Basically, lists of rules of when you are and are not allowed to kill people. Now don't get me started on heraldic codes. So leaving that all to one side, you have this great mixture of people who all believe they're right. To put another way, the admirals in this period are not admirals in charge of a naval service. Think of them as someone who's been put in charge by the government of a collection of CEOs of medium-sized and large companies. All those people are used to running their own shows. They still are running their own shows. And you've got to somehow get them to work together, to actually follow a battle plan. Think about that from perspective. Think about that as a leadership criteria. Think about that as something which do you want to be in charge of? Do you want the job of being in charge of that group? And what's more is because of the fluid nature of nationality in this period, and oh by lord, it is fluid. It's far more fluid than we have necessarily today. Some of those people may or may not be considering wandering over to the other side. E.g., Sir Walter Raleigh, who, well, let's be honest, the Ark Royal, as it was called once it became the Queen's ship, which had started off as the Ark Raleigh, had also at one point been considered by Sir Walter Raleigh to be the vessel he was going to use to get himself into service of the King of Spain, because he could earn more money that way. And who cares what else happens? Raleigh is an interesting character. All of the people are interesting characters, and Charles Howard has to deal with all of them. He has to get them all to follow a battle plan. He might go, well, you know, he's the Queen's High Admiral. If he wants to, he can just order them executed. That's how he wins a fight. The trouble is, if you are threatening to execute someone over every little thing, you can't really get anything done. Imagine if you're going, right, and I want the ships to sail in this formation. Someone goes, no, I'll execute you now if you don't do it in formation. I don't. Just imagine, they're then in charge of their ship, and let's say there's a sailing mishap, and the rigging falls, or their sails aren't working, and they're out of formation, and they have a perfectly... Do you then execute them for this accident? Or do you not? And then you look weak and impotent. What can you do? So you have to try and build a consensus. This is why the diplomatic background really does matter. It's why the diplomatic background has bearing, because leaders in this period are building a band of brothers, to quote that Nelsonic phrase, but this is more of a band of friends, of cousins, of people who might be tangentially related in terms of their interests, but can also find their interests diverging at any point unless they are carefully managed, unless they are carefully organised. And that is ultimately the problem of it. Ultimately, the problem with leadership, with the organisation, what we're going to see as we go through with this entire discussion, is that Howard has to continually deal with this. He has to continually work to manage this system and the relationships between each of them, because, oh my lord. The other scenario you can describe it as being Lord Admiral at this point is being a teacher in a nursery school. Because, quite literally, some of your theoretically grown adult commanders will have the sensitivities of a 5-year-old when it comes to, I think they're being nasty to me. Now, well, sometimes it's true. You are being bullied. There are also times, which you learn as you get older, some people just don't speak the same way as you do. Sometimes they're more brusque. Sometimes their pronunciation of English is slightly different. Sometimes their phraseology sounds more abrupt. Sometimes they are just a naturally clipped speaker who doesn't use unnecessary words. Now, this can come across as brusque, as rude, as anything when you're not used to it. As you get older, you learn these things. By adulthood, you'd expect to be dealing with it. But the trouble is, again, when you're dealing with people who are used to being in charge of everywhere they are, no one speaks like that to them. No one does. It's the classic problem you have with people who are senior officers in the armed forces or senior leaders in any organisation. When they go home and they're confronted by their family, it can cause troubles in their family relationships, because at work they're used to being treated with deference. They're used to being listened to. They're used to being able to do all sorts of things, and people pay attention and respect them and treat them in a certain way. And then at home, they might get a piece of jam toast chucked to them by a 6-month-old, because the 6-month-old just is feeling that way, and they're going, oh, I don't know how to deal with this. And there are people who can compartmentalise and who can go, right then, in one scenario, I am the general. In the other scenario, I am the dad of a surprisingly late in life, but okay, I will deal with this. I'm quite very happy to have this 4-month-old. There are people who can compartmentalise. There are people who can't. One of the things you realise in this period is that quite a lot of the senior officers, the way Effingham has to talk to them, you'd almost think sometimes from the phraseology, they're the ones in charge, not him. But he's the one giving the orders. He's also the one who the buck stops with if things go wrong. Just remember that. He's got to both manage them, but if they manage to muck up and make things go wrong, he's the one who'll get the blame. That's his job. How do things roll in that room, in those ships, in those operations? It's not just be the leader. Not just to be a strategist in terms of getting people to work together, but also to be the one ultimately where the buck stops. The Queen's representative. And the Queen's foil. If he mucks up, it's he who takes the blame, not the Queen. If he succeeds, then you have the glorious heroes and the Queen gets all the honours and he gets to continue doing his job. Lord, oh Lord, is it a thankless task. And that is all going on whilst the Spanish Armada is being organised and is making its path and is being focused on. And today's discussion is not going to be so much about the battle. It's not going to be a play-by-play of the battle. I've done a video like that. This is about the leadership decisions and debates which go around the events of the battle. This is about how Effingham manages to bring this band together and get them to work together. And that's the Shameless book plug. So this is the point where I say thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Thank you for your likes, sharing, subscribing, all the things, patrons, members of the channel, everyone who supports the channel, because without you, it wouldn't be possible. And where I shamelessly plug my own books. More to be coming soon. Hopefully still going to be in March, but if I continue to lose writing days to fences blowing down, weird things happening with boilers. And when I say writing days, I mean turning into the format on the system it needs to be published. That's going to be a problem, but hopefully I won't lose any more, and then I should just squeak it by the end of March. That's the plan. That's the plan. And hopefully that will sell enough copies that will then fund the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And hopefully by the end of the year, with everything sorted out, I'll be in a far better position to talk about the future of the channel, to talk about how things are going to progress longer term, and how things are really changing with me moving down to Cornwall and with this bigger space. At the moment, we're still in the transition phase. We've still got hold of the old house, if you believe that back in Surrey. It's still for sale. It's still not sold. Anyone looking, please, seriously, look at Epsom in Surrey. If you find a house which has a suspiciously orange office in its back garden, you'll know whose it is. But yeah, it's fun. We're getting through everything, but it takes time. Everything takes time. And the bills are massive. But it's all possible thanks to you. So yeah, the pictures are, broadly speaking, sorted for the first book. But it's a case of now getting it all uploaded, put into the format which needs to go through Kindle, direct publishing, etc., as well as Kindle publishing. Hopefully, tick the boxes so it should be downloadable through the Apple system as well, and make sure everything works. It's a brave new world. It's certainly something which I never thought I'd be going into. I always thought I'd be just giving books to publishers and having them publish it. But honestly, and this is no offense meant to the publishers, it's so hard to make any money that way. Travels by Daring has been an excellent book. It has sold out almost every single edition it's published, and it's now on its second edition officially, third, possibly fourth print run, and it does really, really well. It's sold really, really well. Yet the money I've got from it's barely covered the money it cost to do it. And that's not because Pen and Sword are bad. They're good. They're good publishers. I don't want to critique them in any way. It's just the way it goes. It's the way it goes now. With the expenses and the taxes and all the costs put into things. And everything does cost money, and it should cost money. But this is one of the reasons why direct publishing attracts me, because it reduces the number of people in there. Yes, it puts more work on me. Yes, it means it's very much more rise and fall by my abilities. But it does also mean it's only me. And me who's got to find all the money to pay for the pictures, to pay for everything to put in, to do all the software, all the licensing. But it's also, it's me who ultimately reaps the reward. And when I say reap the reward, probably channels it into buying more books, into writing more books. And hopefully gets enough of these out that eventually that I have enough of an ongoing income I can even drop off the consultancy work and just concentrate on writing history, putting out history, and doing the videos. That's the dream. The dream where I can concentrate on doing more history. And that's all been made possible thanks to you. We're all at this level because of you. We're now at the critical point where literally it is going to be the to phrase parental figures, i.e. my mum, who is the person I tend to talk this out with. I know people find it weird that a nearly 40-year-old has these conversations with his mother, but who else am I going to have them with? I have no father, he's dead. My granddad's dead. I can have the conversations with my colleagues, but let's be honest, and my friends, and I do have the conversations with them, but my mum's got many, many years of experience and a lot of knowledge under her belt, has been a director of a couple of companies, has worked in all sorts of things. She has experience and knowledge. And so I do talk about her, and she's basically described the next year for me as bum clenching time. So, thank you. It's all possible thanks to your support. It's all thanks to your support, so thank you. And with that, let's get back to the discussion. Now, this is where this gets interesting, because you've got two cousins here, Francis Drake and John Hawkins, both from naval families, both from the southwest, Plymouth and Cornwall, both of whom are, especially in terms of Drake, would probably be more automatic ones for people to expect me to be doing this year. Because Drake is far more well known, especially. And they probably will come along in the Key Leaders series, but they're not in this video. This video, it makes more sense to talk about Effingham and how he dealt with them. Because, well, he's got one who has a famously fiery temper, had actually had a royal pardon before the age of 20 for killing someone. Probably because the other person was the antagonist, but again, killing them. And another one who sometimes listens to his inner child who goes, I want, I want, I want, and will completely disobey orders. They're both as much adventurers as they are senior officers. This one is not just from a family of ship captains and shipbuilders, but is also treasurer of the Navy. So he's on the Navy board. He's an important person in putting together the fleet. And he's a Vice Admiral. He is the Vice Admiral. And he's an important officer for Effingham to work with. He's third in overall command, is Hawkins. And that gives him great status, that gives him great power, But it also means that he is someone who has, already thanks to his background and status, a lot of capabilities. And so he doesn't necessarily want to listen. Drake, who's coming off a circumnavigation of the world and all these sorts of independent commands, really doesn't want to listen. Really doesn't want to listen. Drake was the other Vice Admiral and de facto second in command. He has a lot of duties. A lot of duties. He's principally who Howard is looking at. Effingham. That is, Lord Howard of Effingham. Skip me between calling him Howard and Effingham because honestly, Effingham rolls off the tongue better, but I'm supposed to call him Howard. But the trouble is there are so many different Lord Howards going around at this point that it feels more natural to call him Effingham. So I do apologise if I skip between two, because that's my brain is saying officially I should be calling him Lord Howard. But Effingham makes more sense because there are going to be other Howards at this period that I'm going to talk about as we go further into this. So I apologise. I'm going to break protocol and just call him Effingham, probably. The thing is, Effingham leans on Drake. He's supposed to lean on Drake. Drake's supposed to be one of his most trusted naval officers. And yet, during this battle, he's going to disobey orders multiple times. And again, with their status as national heroes, with what they've done, he cannot just execute them. He has to keep them in line by other means. By other means. And when you start to look at his other officers he has along there, Martin Frobisher, Lord Henry Seymour, all these are senior officers and senior people who are interesting personalities. I picked the two of them, but there are others there. There are others. And then you have the other complication Effingham has to manage. The Dutch. Justinius van Nassau, that's principally doing, is going to be using his army to try and keep Palmer and other forces busy. There's lots of operations going on, and Howard has to play them all. Yes, people talk about Walsingham, they talk about all the senior officers involved in decisions going on at the time. All the senior government ministers. Cecil. But the thing is, the person who's manoeuvring the fleet has to emphasise and has to think through what are going to be the political and diplomatic consequences of doing this. What is the strategy? What is the wider integration? Effingham is literally the central node where all the information comes into it. And he's going to have to justify his actions, especially if he has to go against what he's being told to do by the more senior ministers and the Queen. But also he's got to justify his actions when he's dealing with his juniors. Because they're junior, but you try telling them that. And his partners, who honestly have other criteria going on as well, because whilst the fall of England would be really, really annoying to the Dutch at this point, they're also dealing with a massive army of occupation themselves, so they're kind of busy. And this all comes into the decision-making process we see throughout the campaign. We really start to see the mixture of force when you consider the fact that the English fleet for the Armada, to confront it, was 160 odd ships, of which 34 were Royal Fleet, of which only 21 were galleons of between 200 to 400 tons, and 12 of the larger ships were actually privateering vessels owned by Effingham, Hawkins and Drake. Now, you'll notice I have called Hawkins a Vice Admiral, because that was one of his titles. Here's where things get fun. I also mentioned Seymour, who is also an admiral of the narrow seas, He's an admiral. He's a vice admiral who enjoys the fleet, but he's not tend to be referred to as a vice admiral in the fleet because he's not a vice admiral of the combined fleet, which they basically form for facing off the Armada. And it's kind of like, technically Hawkins is a vice admiral, but also technically he's a rear admiral, which is he's in charge of the rear. And Drake is the vice admiral, second in command, because he's in charge of the van, the front of the fleet. This is just playing into causing trouble. When people have various ranks depending on what situation they are and can call themselves all sorts of different things, this just adds to complexity. And Effingham has this. Now, famously, of course, when the Spanish Armada is sighted off the Lizard in Cornwall, which is a beautiful space. Basically, you see that bit sticking down out of Cornwall on the map. If I put my finger about here, you'll see it there. That area of the peninsula is called the Lizard Peninsula. It's where you've got things like the Most Southerly Point. It's also where you'll find, not far along it, Coverack, which is one of the places which is absolutely beautiful to go, and my family has a lot of connections with. The side I now live on is well up the northern part of Cornwall. And they are spotted. And famously, there's the tide's in the wrong direction, so they carry on. Drake continues playing bowls. Because there's nothing else for him to do. The ships are loaded. The ships are ready. All you're doing is cramming a load of people aboard the ships quickly, early, before they can even get out to sea with the tide being in the wrong direction. There is absolutely no point in not finishing off that game. And it's whilst Drake gets the famous line, the decision's probably Effingham's, honestly. Drake gets to say the cool line and gets the cool movie made about him. Effingham's the one who's probably going, I could force them, but there's no real point. There's honestly no point. And also for Effingham, there's a bit of an advantage. If you've got Drake wandering off, Hawkins actually has a practical use, being the son of a shipbuilder. He can go check the ships. Drake is a good captain, is a good commander of fleets, but he's not really that helpful at this point. In fact, Drake has a habit, one of his voyages, of actually letting other people, employing other people to manage the loading of ships. So whilst you're doing a last-minute checks and loading ships, probably the person you want least around is Drake, who would just be getting impatient to get out of the sea, which he can't do because the tide's in the wrong direction. So having him off playing bowls is frankly fantastic! They get the fleet out to sea, and they manage to meet up off the Eddystone Rocks, which is still a worthwhile place to go. There's a beautiful views there. And they are sort of downwind from the Armada to its east. So they have to tack. They manage to range there on roughly the 30th of July, and they have to tack round the wind to try and gain the weather gauge, which is, of course, the advantageous position in age of sail. Having the weather gauge. It puts you in a position where you can actually consider crossing your opponent's T. Remember the great phrase from the Battle of Tsushima and from the Battle of Jutland, when you want to be going that point, you want to have all your guns focused on the enemy, while they can have very few guns focus on you. That's what they're looking for. Now, Howard, i.e. Effingham, gotta keep reminding that, was with the Ark Royal, which was his flagship, and the bulk of the fleet. But he had Drake to the north of him, in revenge, with 11 ships supporting him, acting in the van. They noted the crescent formation which the Armada moved into. They were sailing in a very hodgepodge formation when they were off the coast of Lizard when they were first spotted, but they did manage to get into far more of their crescent formation, which was their defensive formation, which allowed the most powerful ships to be positioned in a place where they could hopefully hold off the British, the English, the fleet. I can't call it the Royal Navy because it's not the Royal Navy. It's a collection of ships, and again, as I said, it really more apt to call it British because there are people who come from Ireland in the fleet. There are people who come from Scotland in the fleet. all sorts of people mixed in. It's far more accurate to call it British, but it's technically for the English crown. They're acting. So it's the English fleet. But believe it or not, there were quite a lot of Scottish Protestants who were not keen on the idea of a Catholic takeover of England. It's amazing how strangest bedfellows will be made by situations. And so they were playing different sort of games, though, because the Spanish style of fighting was very much to close, fire a devastating broadside, and then use their overwhelming number of troops and personnel they have aboard their ships to board and seize the ship. The English, who have far less crew aboard their ships, don't want to do that. Their crew are better trained for naval fighting. They have shorter carriage cannon, so they're more easier for reloading and firing on board vessel versus the field cannon which the Armada are carrying, because they need them to support the army once ashore. And so they want to stay off and have a naval engagement and bombardment and basically try and punch holes in the Spanish vessels to slow them down, make them unwieldy, and maybe even sink them. That's their plan. And so what you get is a very interesting battle off Plymouth at one point developing, where the English fleet keeps bombarding the ships from the Spanish from range, and the Spanish keep trying to be tempted to close down to try and grapple, and then they're held in position and to hold in position to defend their formation, and that's causing them problems. Neither force loses a ship in action that day, but the whole action, the way they're handling, has meant that the English fleet can really hold on to the Spanish. This is Effingham again holding it together. Drake wants to run off, Drake wants to do things, and Effingham's going, no, we need to keep order, we need to keep organisation, we need to keep up this bombardment. And he's also got to arrange things and order things. He's got Hawkins sending out messages, and he's sending out messages to try and arrange for ammunition and food stores and things to be ahead at various places, should the English fleet need to go in, restock, and come out and carry on fighting. So if they run out of ammunition, they can carry on the fight. Which is very easy for them, because they have the infrastructure nearby. They're starting off at Plymouth. They've got Portsmouth up ahead. They've got the whole spaces at Chatham. They've got all sorts of supply positions along the coast for them to draw from, which the Spanish, of course, don't have. Which is another reason why the Spanish are very careful about what they're using, what they're firing, because they don't have the easy logistical supply. And then we have the other issues. As it gets closer to August, they continue on engaging. There's another engagement off the Portland Bill in the Isle of Wight. And while the Spanish are being forced to manoeuvre, trying to fight for weather gauge, trying to close with the English fleet, there's actually a collision. The Santa Ana and the Nuestra Señora del Rosario collide. And they collide with other ships as well. And, well, she has her bowsprit lost and all sorts of interesting issues. And she begins to drift. And she's gone off by the current and the wind in the opposite direction, far away, and getting closer to the English fleet. Now, that night, Drake was supposed to be leading the fleet. He was supposed to have his lantern lit. He was one of the best navigators. He had some of the best navigators aboard. He's in the van. And his lantern goes out. And mysteriously, the next morning, he finds himself next to the Rosario. Well, rather, later that night. And he managed to take her. They seize gunpowder, which is always described by Drake as being much needed. Wasn't much needed. There was lots of infrastructure, there was lots of gunpowder around. Yeah, they didn't need the extra gunpowder to be seized from this ship. It really doesn't help that much. And lots of 50,000 gold ducats. That's more helpful. The fact that the fleet stayed as close together as it did, even after Drake snuffed out his light, is thanks to Effingham organising his captains and trying to organise the force. He even almost considers forcing a battle before Drake manages to return. Now, he considers it. He decides that actually closing too close, it's going to give away his entire advantage. He's been thinking about, if we close up, will our bombards be more effective? Will our gunnery be more effective? And this is while you're getting sort of to the Isle of Wight. Portland Bill is there. The Isle of Wight is there. That lovely sticking out bit is Portland Bill. And, well, this is interesting. Because he's trying to play off the different tactics and work out what to do, but also how to coordinate his force. Now, the thing is, to keep firing, to keep causing operations, well, for the crammed Spanish ships, this is not a good thing. At this point, while they're doing these operations, that the San Salvador's gunpowder magazine goes boom. The ship ends up on fire, and the Spanish tried to scuttle it, but they'd failed by the time the Golden Hind came upon them. And so she was another vessel captured. She hadn't been fully taken apart by a gunpowder magazine. Shows to an extent how much gunpowder she was realistically carrying, in what condition it was in, and also suggests that was similar of other Spanish vessels at this point. Remember, they're expecting to use their cannon far less often. They're expecting to get a whole lot of supplies from Palma for the army, and they're expecting a very easy, short operation once they get ashore in England, because there isn't enough of an army there for them to fight, as far as they're concerned. And to be honest, they're not particularly wrong. The most professional force you have in England at this point are probably the trained bands of London. But the odds are that if a battle was close enough to London, the trained bands would have come out and joined with the Royal Army and the other levies which have come from the rest of the country, and there could have been a very interesting fight. Because those trained bands are very, very professional, and there's a reason why to this day the regiment which maintains their descendancy from the trained bands is known as the Artisans Regiment, and they are the Reserve Special Air Service Regiment. So they have a long history of being a very highly trained professional force. It would have been an interesting fight. I think the Spanish would probably have won it, but it would have been an interesting fight. There is a chance they lose, but, there's always a chance. The Spanish logistics are always interesting, but even making ashore is going to cause trouble. At this point, the Armada were considering various options, including maybe using the Isle of Wight to make a temporary base in the Solent. But they don't get the information in time. They've not got the communications going on with the Duke of Parma's army with what's going on. And what Effingham does is he puts Frobisher in charge of one squadron, Drake in charge of another squadron, and he and Hawkins take the other two squadrons, and they break it into 4 groups, and they attack from different angles. And by doing this, they force the Armada to maneuver, to break for safer places. Because the thing is, every time Medina Sidonia tries to shift his force around to deal with attack from one squadron, the other squadron's coming in from a different direction. And they're competing and acting. And in a way, Effingham uses the competition between Frobisher, between Hawkins, between Drake, to his advantage. Basically, go for it and see which one of you can do the most damage. If you can't control them, use their own instincts to control them. Get them to control themselves. And that is what Effingham has to do a lot of the time. He has to balance the plans, balance the appointments, balance the roles given to people, so that their natural inclinations will work for him. He's learned his lesson of letting Drake go in the van. And basically, from this point onwards, Drake, if you're not going to get trusted with the lantern duties. Or if you are, there's going to be someone aboard your ship who I trust to have a conversation with you. and who is senior enough that if you decide to try and get rid of them, you're going to get into trouble. Find the nearest Queen's favourite, stick him aboard the ship, preferably a pompous one. He'll want to keep to the orders. Imagine he's in charge because he's a senior and he's a Queen's favourite. So if anything happens to him, the Queen will be annoyed, and you know that won't end well for you, will it, Drake? You might still get away with it, but you don't know, so behave. At this point, then, he carries on thinking this through. How are we going to deal with them once the Armada manage to get off Calais? And they've got a fairly safe position. How do you deal with them? How do you organise it? Well, now you have to persuade people to give up their ships to become fireships. Yeah. Remember that? The figure, there's 160-odd ships in the fleet, of which 30 are royal. The rest, all privately owned ships, all commercial assets which make their owners money. Now you want to do fire ships. Now, this whole situation comes about because, well, Justinius van Nassau, the Admiral General, commander of the Dutch forces that were basically blockading the Duke of Parma's army of Flanders into where they were. You see, because of the nature of the waters around the Dutch Republic and Netherlands area, there's a large amount of shallow water. And whilst Parma has vessels which can get his army out, the Armada doesn't really have vessels, doesn't really have the forces they need, despite having galeases, etc., to be able to really cover their exit. They have a plan in theory. In practice, they don't really have much for ships, unless it's well coordinated. Parma's force can't get out unless the Armada force is in place. But the Armada force, once there, cannot wait there because there isn't a safe anchorage space for them to anchor. So you're left with what some would call an insurmountable command problem, in that without radio communications, without satellite communications, without any form of long-range communications that works to coordinate these forces, you've got to somehow get the timing to work. And that's why they are now sat in Calais, and why the Duke of Parma's forces blockaded in, well, pretty much in Dunkirk. It's not a good time for them. It's not a good time. Now, with this being the case, Howard actually picks up more ships. He gets Seymour joining him. I've talked about Lord Seymour. And also William Winter, who is another of those great surveyor and rigger of the Royal Navy for 40 years. So many senior titles. Technically not now another Vice Admiral, but also still quite senior. On the board of the Navy. Lead us to join it. It's the complicated command structures of Elizabethan England. And so you've got all these senior officers gathered together, and well, you have to get some fireships. And he managed to persuade Drake to offer one of his ships, the Thomas, Hawkins to offer one of his ships, the Buck Bond, and gets 6 other ships all volunteered to be fireships. They are between 90 and 200 tons. These are not small vessels for the time. These are not inexpensive assets for the time, and yet they are being volunteered to be used as fireships. Think about the level of persuasion that has to go into this. And then, not only do you have to get them organised, you have to leave the loaded guns and stores aboard the ships. You fill them as quickly as you can with pitch, brimstone and tar, or any flammable materials, and you deploy them 9th of the 7th and 8th of August. Just think of that. Your formation is not a service, not a force. It is a load of disparate owners. And you're getting some of those owners to willingly give up their ships to be used as fireships. They might do damage to the enemy, they might not. There's no guarantee. They're literally going to be burning their money in sight of themselves. The thing is, these vessels were large enough that, frankly, the Spanish felt they were hellburners. They thought that they were like the vessels which were used at the Siege of Antwerp, which had been absolutely devastating. They managed to intercept 3 of the 8 fire vessels and tow them away, but the other 5 managed to break into the fleet. They intercept them, by the way, with boats, ship's boats, being rowed by their volunteers jumping onto the fireships, attaching ropes and trying to pull them out of the way. Whilst the largest vessels held their positions, and that's mainly because they had enough boats around them. This included, of course, Medina Sidonia's flagship. Much of the fleet cuts their anchor cables and scatters. And this is the worst scenario you've got when you're facing the English, who are, let's be honest, for a large part, privateers. The English fleet is largely privateers. And Effingham knows this, and he can use this to his advantage. So whilst the Spanish vessels aren't burnt, their crescent formation is broken, their harbour formation is broken, they are scattered up and down the coast, and the English fleet, they are ready for battle. They are ready for battle. And this is what Effingham has been in many ways waiting for. He's been wanting it. He's been toying with closing with the Spanish, because he knows, firing from the ranges he was firing, he was harrying them, he was harassing them, he was wounding them, but he wasn't killing them. And he needs to kill them. To stop this fleet, to stop this force, to stop it as an actual threat, because it itself carries a large enough army, it could cause trouble if landed in England. The actual scenario they should probably have done was to land and secure a place in England and then send a fleet over to get Palma. So it would have been an administrative operation, but they didn't do that. They wanted to do a coup de grace, a coup de main. They wanted to do a one-punch. Look how massive our army is! We brought our best general as well. Prepare to shudder. And yes, everyone would have shuddered, but the thing is, organising such a thing is very, very difficult. It truly is. Hello. You worried I'm going to be rude about Raleigh again? I'm not being rude about you, it's Sir Walter Raleigh, and he's a bit nutty. He's not here, though. Sorry, he's just noticed his birthday present, which arrived. Do we want to? Do we like it? We're wagging our tail at it. It's yours. Now you're giving me a kiss. You're going to kiss the ballie and play with it, or you... No? Do you want it? It's a ball. You literally... You play with it normally. Okay. Oh, you like it. Oh, that's good. Oh, good. You like it. Sorry. And this is the situation. Sorry about the interlude there, but, you know, happy bally time had to take place. That leads to the Battle of the Gravelines. And this is another point where you have Effingham really putting his leadership skills on the line to try and organise this. It is a fleet. It is a fleet. That's worth calling it. But it's also something which is definitely not a fleet as we would understand it today. Now the thing is, unlike after the Isle of Wight, where they'd been short on shot and short on powder, now you've got a fleet which has been resupplied. The arrival of Seymour, the arrival of Winter, their forces had really helped Effingham build up his strength. The fact is, there's also the whole Drake likes to focus on the type of the capturing of the Spanish vessel with all its powder. But let's be honest, the arrival of all the British ships, which were also loaded with powder and shot, really helped. And they'd also got some other resupplies as well. And now you find yourself a situation after these Fireships happen, where Medina Sidonia, with only a very small number of ships, roughly 5 of them, 5 ships, found themselves facing the entirety of this English fleet. And this is an English fleet which has worked out that if they can get the Spanish to fire their salvo before they get within range, then they can close to 100 yards and be safe distance from grappling, but blast away without any Spanish response, because the Spanish doctrine was to fire and then close to grapple, which was how they fought their battles. It's not a bad doctrine, it's just not a good doctrine if you're playing against someone who doesn't believe in the whole fire then close to battle. I.e. anyone who's decided that, you know what, Roman legionary tactics, they're great, but they're not how we fight naval battles. Romans used to stand off, fire their pillar, and then close with gladius and shield. That's how you did it. Because again, if you fire a pillar, you can pin a enemy shield, hold it, and they have to drop it. And so they've not got a shield, and you've got your system. It all makes sense. Oh, you can break up their formation if they're pikemen or they're the phalanx with all their spears and all these things. You can do that. That works. But in a naval battle, once you've advanced out of the Mediterranean and the galleys and galleases, etc., and you're into this kind of frigate, a nascent ship in a line combat, it's not the way you're going to fight it. Now, there are other naval commanders of the Spanish who could have adapted their tactics, who could have pushed it more, but Medina Sidonia isn't because of his background. Whereas Effingham has spent his entire time reining in his commanders and trying to keep them under control and somewhat coordinated, Sidonia doesn't really have to do that because he has a very professionalised force in so many ways because they spent so many years fighting together. But the trouble is, he's reading off someone else's playbook. Someone else wrote this playbook. Someone else has put this force together. He's having to command it, but he doesn't have the fluency with it to be able to adapt it to the circumstances. The only way I got to be able to finish this was I had to take away the birthday present. He's now hunting for it. Everywhere. Sorry. Even with this, though, there are limits. The cannon aren't very big. The cannon aren't very powerful. And so, after about 2 hours of bombardment, those 5 ships start to be getting reinforced. And they can only keep up the firing for roughly 8 hours, despite them alternating. And so it's about after 1600 hours, the English fleet fights last shots and pulls back. There had been some vessels lost. Those were not really lost in the fighting. They were lost more to the sea damage of the spreading out after the Fireships attacks and the accumulation of some of the fire damage. But again, with all this going on, they spot something, and they spot some opportunities. And this time Effingham does it himself, because he spots that the San Lorenzo, the flagship of the Don Hugo de Moncada, who was it's a galleys, so it's a galley which is more fitted for open seas in many regards. A galleys, that's how I would describe it, and it had been forced to run aground to avoid the sinking, to avoid the cumulative damage of the night before and the fighting. And Effingham goes, right then, ships, boats, carrier by boarding. Moncada himself is killed in the boarding action. There is various arguments made. Some people claim that he was aimed at and shot because of some distinctiveness he was carrying. They were using arquebuses. Aiming is to an extent, I'm pointing at that wall and I'll hit somewhere on it. Whilst people then tend to bring up the shortness of the range, I point out they're on 2 ships which are both moving in the water, even with one grounded. That doesn't tend to help with things. It was an absolute fight, pell-mell fight. And there were lots of people who got caught up in the fight, including the galley slaves. Never a good idea for that, to get the slaves involved in fighting for a ship. If you have your crew, if your ship is crewed by slaves, in terms of your oarsmen, that's not a good situation to be in. There is a reason why in the professional navies which used oared vessels, i.e. the Romans, they had not wanted to use slaves. They wanted to use freedmen, because freemen don't tend to turn on you in the middle of a fight, and there are significantly more of them usually. The French were looking on at this battle and just mainly enjoying themselves, because it meant the Spanish were fighting the English, and the English were fighting the Spanish, and that meant neither of them were fighting them at that point, which was also useful. They did open fire when they felt that the English were getting too close to the French coast, but other than that, they left it. They left it. Next day, well, the San Mateo runs aground in between Sly and Ostend, and Francis Vere, another of those wonderful personalities which Effingham is always getting to deal with, takes a combination of Dutch and English fleet vessels and, well, sees her. There are others as well, which are examples, including Justinus van Nassau himself managed to take possession of some ships. They're all having fun. There's plenty of ships to go round. There's plenty of opportunities for greatness, for glory, for plunder. Now, this has been an interesting discussion for me. It's always interesting to think about Effingham and how his role worked in the battle. But also, I have done a little bit more than that. You see, I was a little bit naughty in this video, and I'm going to talk about it now. You might have noticed that at certain points, my good, fluffy research assistant has been jumping in. I've been letting him play with his ball. His birthday present. Which he's very thankful for. Now the thing is, why did I have that going on? Why did I leave that in? Why didn't I edit it out? Well, because when you're dealing with certain personality types, and I do find I'm using Raleigh as an example because it fits. They're going to chase things. If you stick a bouncy ball in front of 90% of dogs, they will chase it. They will want it. They love it. And Effingham understands this. It's the same with Drake and the ship he goes and captures. To an extent, why doesn't Effingham tell him off? Why doesn't Effingham execute him? Why doesn't Effingham do all the options he could have had open to him? Because he's still useful. And the thing is, whilst, yes, he chased it down, yes, he went and did that and got himself a nice prize, but it's not a bad thing. It's about using that. It's about using that skill. It's about using what motivates them. Well, the thing is, in the middle of this, because he got himself worked up, I paused the video and I went out and played Baldy in the garden for a good, saying that word could revive him, didn't, for a good 45 minutes, which I do most days. He had a lovely time. I had a lot of frying practice. He's calm. It's like that in walks. You know, you balance them. That's how you lead a dog. You work with its instincts. You work with it as an animal. And whilst, yes, humans are ultimately slightly more complex beings than canines, because honestly, a canine doesn't have the patience or the temperament to do some of the things humans will get up to. It is, broadly speaking, the same duty. Effingham has to lead by working with the tendencies of his commanders. He has to lead by working with their personalities, with what incentivizes them. That's how he gets them to give up those ships. The Fireships are a classic example. He gets them to volunteer. Getting Drake to volunteer one of his own ships. And you notice also from that list, who doesn't? There are some serious skills going on here in leadership, in building a consensus, in making sure you never walk into a council of war or any meeting without first knowing how everyone's going to play it out. Effingham has to balance his queen, his duty, all the government ministers, and all the personalities of his own subordinates. And he has to get them to work together, because if they don't work together as one force, then they won't work. Here's the thing. If Drake put up a signal trying to direct the fleet, Hawkins wouldn't pay any attention to him. Because that's Drake. And Hawkins, despite being his cousin, is not going to take orders from him. Because he's a member of the Navy board. Effingham can't start giving orders, can't tell someone else to go and do his job. He has to do it. But if he gives the order in the wrong way, he'll never get those people to follow him. He's helped by the pace of battle in this period. Honestly, you couldn't do this style of leadership to an extent with such disparate bodies without the reinforcement of the Royal Navy as a service and the service rules and the service laws later on in the Age of Sail, because the pace of conflict is that much faster. That much faster. Ultimately, the Armada, the most devastating thing to it is the storms of the North Sea and the North Atlantic. And its passage round Scotland Island. That's where it loses far more ships than any other scenario. But those are accumulation because they've been forced to go up through the channel. And they can't dive back through the channel. They're too split up. They're too broken. There's no chance of them forming up that crescent again and being able to go back. Because if they could form that crescent again, they might have a chance. They never get that opportunity. They're harried by the forces of the English fleet going north, chasing them. Now, if they had managed to form up while they were rounding Scotland and then dive through the Irish Sea and maybe descended on Wales or northern Cornwall or even north-west England, that would have been a problem. That would have been a massive problem. But they didn't manage to do that. Because again, how can you? In the Age of Sail, once you're that split up, with the navigation you have at the time, without prior arrangements and a lot of pre-planning, it's very difficult to bring a fleet back together. It's very, very difficult to bring a fleet back together. Effingham leads a disparate band, not a band of brothers, not even a band of friends, a band of competitors. And he gets them to work together. He gets them to execute some quite complex maneuvers for their time and implement them. And he does it by leadership, by knowing what they are. I gave you the example of the dog. He's a good dog. He's a wonderful fluff. And for those wondering, don't worry, I do a similar game with the Corgi, but I do it at a slightly different schedule, because each of them deserves some solo time with Papa, because apparently they both like that. natural way. And also because if you're playing bally with both of them, the corky tries to pick up the poodle's ball, which is far too big for his jaws, and it's just hilarious, but also could hurt him. So you can't do that. Effingham has to maintain a personal and a collaborative relationship with each of those officers. Does this mean he never has a crossword with any of them? Does this mean he never argues with them? No, he does. He tells them off. But he berates them from a position of respect. And he can do that because of his education, but because of his familial background. He's been to sea enough times. He's done enough service. He's done enough duties that they know he actually knows what he's talking about. And this is one of the interesting things about the leadership in this period and afterwards. Often people associate lords with a kind of French Revolution style nobility, where you have a lot of people who are in positions, but who don't know why they are there. This always struck me as interesting when I read about it in terms of the continental nobility versus the English nobility, and the Scottish nobility, etc. In that you get a far higher percentage, it seems, in Britain, of nobles who know why they are there. I.e., we're here because we're the naval lords, as in the Effingham, the Howard Effinghams. We serve at sea. If you go down their family tree as well as up, you find sea service coming up quite a lot. We will train our juniors in how to do this. And I won't say it's uniquely British. Please, no, I'm not claiming that at all. It's far from it. But there seems to be quite a high prevalence of it in the British system. And I think that's probably because at various times, thanks to our own civil war and other instances, we have had a sort of meritocratic approach to lords, in that we have found ways to make people lords who are deserving of it, and mitten them up. And then they venerate, of course, how they became a lord. But they have to continue doing it, because you can't really have... isn't enough land in Britain, really, for you to have vast estates and all nobles to be content with that. They have to look elsewhere to earn their money. They have to invest in industry. They have to invest in wool and wood and tobacco and merchant activities, and which means, in the nicest way, the quickest way to go bankrupt is to not know what you're investing in. And when you again look at Effingham, Lord Howard of Effingham, he's providing some of the largest ships, and quite a large number of them, of the fleet that fights at this battle, that fights for the English fleet. His own ships. And why does he have those ships? Because he likes having them? No, they're what are his major source of income. Are all his ships that he owns used this? No. Some are off doing merchant activities. Some are off privateering. And again, with the privateers, those are vessels which are almost like Viking raiding ships. If they turn up and find a well-defended establishment, they're traders. Hello, we're here to sell our wares, buy stuff, exchange. If they turn up and find a place which is suitably rich, but suitably undefended, I have brought axe. It's the same with privateers. Often the distinction between privateers and merchant vessels in this period is very, 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 very grey. So this is the reality you're looking at in this period. Rather than thinking of all the nobles aboard these ships, all the captains, as being nobles who don't know what they're talking about and entirely depend upon the sailing master for running their ships, and no, actually a lot of them did. And whilst there were some who didn't because they ran out of ones who did, and didn't have enough who did, those ones who were not usually at senior ranks. Because again, who do you trust in charge of your ship? Who's going to be in charge of a Howard Effingham ship? It's going to be someone from the family normally, or a family friend who's basically part of the family but not blood. Who's going to be in charge of Drake's ships? Again, it's usually extended family. Why? Because you trust them, but also because as part of your extended family, they're going to have probably received some education in what you're doing. Because they're part of the family business. And the family business is the sea. It's maritime affairs. And this is really the interesting thing, because in many ways the Spanish have the more professional force, but they have a force which is, because of how they've grown the Armada and because of how they've had to collect people, it's more orientated on other campaigns and other experiences than they are on fighting a campaign in the Bay of Biscay, in the Channel, in the North Sea. They haven't got the requisite leadership experience at those levels, especially when Santa Cruz is gone. Medina Sidonia does his best. Lord love him, he does his best. But he's no Effingham. He is no Effingham when it comes to leading his various officers and coordinating everyone and working with them all. And getting the best out of them. With that being said, and that all being thought through, hopefully, and hopefully you found it interesting, I've got a question. I always end my videos with a question, and I'm not going to change now. I want you to think about yourself. And think about leaders you've worked with who've been in charge of you. What's been the best methodology of positive methodology which has worked with your personality to get you to do what they needed you to do? Think about that. Think about when have you been really excited about doing a job, about how it was phrased and introduced to you. Think about it. And just think about what they were offering. You don't have to put it in the comments, but you don't have to put it in the comments below. It's always interesting if you do. If you've got good examples you want to put below. And I know I used the dog in this, and I know some people like that, some people won't. But it just seemed to me a brilliant example, because I love my dogs. I train them as well as I can. They are spirited animals. They are still guard dogs, and they were really perturbed by the move, I would say, moving house. And having a bad ear in the case of Raleigh. But they've been better. But we do a lot of training by positive reinforcement, by working with their natural inclinations, by working with what they want to do. And I do a lot of the same when I'm leading people. I try and find the tasks which they enjoy. And then I ask them what motivates them. Why do they enjoy that task? And then I try and adapt other tasks in a way that they will get a similar enjoyment out of that, or will find a similar thing to enjoy in that task. Because it's always easier to lead people who want to follow, to manage people who want to do their tasks. In fact, when they want to do it, it tends to be that they become rather self-managing and self-leading, and that makes your life a lot easier. So, coming up next week, we've got Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, the man who could have succeeded with the Spanish Armada. I thought it'd be good to do a comparison between him and Effingham. Hope you're going to enjoy that. Take care, thank you for watching, and hope you enjoyed. Toodles.